Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders at the intersection of culture and science for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health issues. Proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Sammon Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of our boards, we are honored to host today's special preview screening of curated clips from the award-winning documentary film CURED that highlights a pivotal but little-known moment in LGBTQ history when activists in 1973 rose up to challenge the American Psychiatric Association to remove the diagnosis of homosexuality from its Manual of Mental Illnesses, better known as the DSM, and they won. CURED has been nominated for numerous awards, including an Emmy, and just last week it was announced the film is the sole recipient of the 2022 Austin Riggs Erickson Prize for Excellence in Mental Health Media. Following the 25-minute screening, preeminent filmmakers Patrick Sammon and Bennett Singer will be joined in conversation by world-renowned author and mental health LGBTQ activist, Dr. Andrew Solomon, to talk about the lessons from this film that remain profoundly relevant in today's ongoing global fight for LGBTQ equality. We'd like to thank each of our distinguished guests for taking the time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge and expertise with our open mind audience. In the interest of time, I'm going to share a very abbreviated version of each of their very impressive bios. Patrick Sammon is the co-producer and co-director of CURED. A resident of Washington, D.C., he previously served as creator and executive producer of Codebreaker, an award-winning drama documentary about the life and legacy of gay British codebreaker Alan Turing that reached more than 3 million viewers worldwide. Bennett Singer is a Los Angeles-based filmmaker. His previous credits include co-directing Electoral Dysfunction, an award-winning film on voting rights, and Brother Outsider, a documentary portrait of the gay civil rights activist Bayard Rustin that premiered at Sundance and won more than 20 international prizes. Bennett has also written or edited 5 books and is the former executive editor of Time Magazine's education program. And Dr. Andrew Solomon, who we welcome back to the Open Mind for his 3rd appearance, is a writer and lecturer on politics, culture, and psychology. He is a professor of clinical medical psychology at Columbia University Medical Center, a lecturer in psychiatry at Yale Medical School, and the former president of PEN America. Most recently, he made an award-winning film, Far From the Tree, based on his book by the same name that received the National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as more than 25 other national and international awards. Dr. Solomon is also the author of The Noonday Demons, an atlas of depression that won the National Book Award and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and has been published in 24 languages. He's written numerous other books, received numerous awards, including the Erickson Award, and his writing appears frequently in The New Yorker and The New York Times. He's often a guest on NPR, and his TED Talks have been viewed over 20 million times. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. The discussion portion of today's program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofthesammelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, information about the Friends Research Scholar Program that awards grants to early career neuroscientists at UCLA, and about our 3rd annual Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 27th, 2023. High school students from all over the country are invited to submit short films about mental health issues of importance to them. And I'm excited to say that we've already received entries for next year's festival. So if you are a high school student or if you know any high school students, we encourage you to submit your films ASAP. All details can be found on our website, again, friendsofthesemmeleinstitute.org. And finally, the last segment of today's program is reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask a question, we ask that you please type it into the Q&A that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now sit back, relax, and enjoy these specially curated 25-minute clips from CURED. The panel will come on immediately following. Thank you so much.
They can be anywhere. They can be policemen. They can be school teachers. They can be judges, lawyers. We ought to know we've arrested all of them. And if we catch you with a homosexual, your parents are going to know about it first. And you will be caught. And the rest of your life will be a living hell.
Most Americans are repelled by the mere notion of homosexuality.
And homosexuals should be barred from the police department, the fire department, and teachers in our city schools.
2 out of 3 Americans look upon homosexuals with disgust, discomfort, or fear.
I had one friend who was beaten savagely by his father. He beat him, in fact, with bricks.
We discovered that Americans favor legal punishment. A vast majority believe that homosexuality is an illness.
And what do you suggest we could do about them?
Give them homes like they do for the mentally insane.
Homosexuality is, in fact, a mental illness which has reached epidemiological proportions.
Many psychiatrists now believe that homosexuality is learned behavior.
And like almost anything else that is learned, it can be unlearned.
I charge the psychiatric profession with creating a poisoned climate of thinking about homosexuality.
To be viewed as psychologically disturbed is to be treated as a second-class citizen. And being a second-class citizen is not good for my mental health.
Gay rights! What's the solution? Revolution! Gay rights! What's the solution? Revolution!
Yeah, this was a sort of a selfie of the generation. It's a self-portrait where I set up the camera and used a self-timer, trying to look very cool as one was supposed to look in those days. When I was 16, I knew that I was gay. I couldn't tell my parents. I couldn't tell religious leaders. If it was exposed, you would bring shame on your family. The word meant you were mentally ill. As a kid, just scared shitless.
I was in junior high school, and the word got out that I was a lesbian. Well, my mother was very upset with what she had heard, and her idea was, this is not normal. And if I didn't consent to get married, that I would go to Utica. And that was the mental institution. I got married at 14. Well, most people in those days, that's what they thought. You know, you get married, okay, you be cured. Or we're going to put you in the mental institution.
It is very hard nowadays to have any awareness of how different the world was for gay people. in the 1950s and 60s. We had church deciding homosexuality was sinful, governments deciding that it was criminal, and then we had psychiatrists state that we were sick. Both of my parents were psychoanalysts, so I read the psychiatric literature in my teens and 20s. It said gay people are universally nasty, pathetic, psychotic, manipulative, superficial, unable to form real relationships. As a young gay person, that was devastating.
I was wondering if you think that there are any, quotes, happy homosexuals?
The fact that somebody is homosexual automatically rules out the possibility that he will remain happy for long, in my opinion.
Many of these psychiatrists were in charge of the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA. This was by far the most important psychiatric organization on earth. It was the biggest, it was the richest, it was the most influential. And they had the power, ultimately calling homosexuality a mental illness in the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1952. Thousands of gay people went to psychiatrists to be cured, as if that were the main thing wrong in their life. The most typical treatment was talk therapy, but many gay people were subjected to more aggressive treatment.
They were unable to cope with the fact that I was gay. And so they looked for a doctor who was going to cure me. And when I first saw him, I recall his statement to me that, well, we could castrate you, but let's try some treatments and see what we can do there. Next thing, I was going into a mental institution and receiving shock therapy. It was a very frightening experience. We would wait for maybe an hour or two for your turn. With utter terror, the clock would go and you'd have people, someone would come and call the individuals, and you knew when your turn was coming, and how each time that you would hope against hope that it wasn't your turn yet, that there would be one more time before you had to go into the little room. You would go into a fairly small cubicle. A little machine would be wheeled into the room. And you're aware constantly of this little box over there and what it's going to do to you.
It will help you to get well.
That would be the last thing that I would recall, would be just spinning wildly out of control till you lose total consciousness.
Many of us did have various treatments, including shock. I personally don't know anybody who was a friend of mine who underwent a lobotomy, but that did happen.
Ready? Why did you have that operation, you know?
I think it was something to do with my sexual intercourse.
It takes away memories. Chunks of a person's life are missing forever.
I saw things that anybody who hadn't been through, who couldn't allow themselves to believe could happen in this country. But it was like a, you know, a horror movie.
And soon at psychiatric meetings, there were demonstrations, if not in fact riots.
In every major city, something happened. In Chicago, in Atlanta, in New York, in Boston. At one convention, I was with Barbara Giddings, and our people all came in and proceeded to invade the ordination of all the new psychiatrists. Well, there was a group of elderly psychiatrists, and they were wearing honorary gold medals and ribbons, and they proceeded to attack the invaders and beat them over the head with their gold medals, literally, and chase them all back out the door. The whole thing was going to fade away if something wasn't done. So I marched up, climbed up on the platform, and I proceeded to denounce them, while they shook their fists at me and called me a Nazi. And I said, I'm a scientist by training and background, and if they felt it was a disturbance or a disorder or a pathology, fine, let them present their good, sound, solid scientific evidence to show it, and they never did.
The demonstrations shocked the American Psychiatric Association enormously, and organized psychiatry was scuttling for safety. Well, they didn't realize, well, to some people, this is a matter of a serious concern in their lives.
When gay liberation came along, I was a doctoral student at UCLA, and there was some sense that something was going to change for me.
I'm very seriously, I'm a firm believer in free speech, but...
In October of 1970, this big conference was happening in Los Angeles. I got up and walked up to the front of the room, to this stage, and I took the microphone.
This is what we're going to be doing, baby.
The doctor takes it back. What they didn't expect was me to grab that from him, and we were going to talk, not them.
We're going to be talking about what you are going to do to clear up your own fucked mind.
We want to deal with people who come to us and say, I feel anxiety, I feel hostility, I feel tension.
You've been giving me orders. We have listening to you people for years. Now you listen to us. Mental institutions, bullshit. Shock therapy, no thank you. What is very clear to us today, what you people out there call free speech, in fact, has been a monologue for over a half-century.
We explained we would break down into small groups because they had never sat down and talked with gay people, where the shrinkologists weren't in charge. Gay and lesbian people were saying, we are the experts in our lives, and we will tell you what it's like being gay. And the shrinkologists were listening to these gay people. There was true dialogue taking place.
Through the avenues of protest, confrontation, and dialogue, gay activists have had success in persuading some well-respected psychiatrists to reevaluate their thinking in relation to homosexuality.
I don't believe that psychiatry should come through to individuals in a moral, judgmental, or religious way.
We are interested in helping the individual homosexual. The despair you create, sir, in burying the homosexual, in taking him out of the realm of medicine and psychiatry, I would say is much worse. I am for civil rights. I was the first psychiatrist in America.
Charles Socarides became the most vigorous proponent of homosexuality as an illness that's treatable and curable. And he would say often that he's for civil liberties and equal protection of people who are homosexual. But the fact of the matter is, his own writings were precisely the arguments used by people who want to deny homosexuals equal protection.
Charles Socarides had a very thriving private practice. Treating gay people and offering them the cure, his first book on the subject was called The Overt Homosexual, and it was dedicated to me and my sister. Charles Socarides was my dad. We lived in a townhouse on East 78th Street, and his office, where he saw patients, was in the downstairs, and my bedroom was on the top floor. When he was 3 flights below, attempting a cure for homosexuality, I was upstairs, being a young homosexual, experimenting along the way, as high school students do, with early sexual experiences. And it never occurred to me that this was something you could alter or change. It just was. I was very careful and quiet about it. I felt that if my homosexuality became public, it could be embarrassing to him and it could bring unwanted, notoriety to me. I mean, I was as much afraid for him as I was for myself.
I've suggested to the government that a National Center for Sexual Rehabilitation be started, in which a great deal of research and treatment and training must be done.
Less than a decade ago, a national poll showed that 2/3 of the American people feared and hated homosexuals. But now, if the success of books, magazines, and movies about homosexuals is any indication, that attitude is changing.
Do you know what the word homosexual means? They say it's a sickness that has to be cured.
I don't want to talk about it.
Damn it, look at me. Does that change me so much? I'm still your father.
Ben and I aren't getting married. He's not my type. He's not your type. He is witty. He is attractive. He's successful. He's gay.
By being so open about it, by the media publicizing it, it helped to bring a fresh breeze into the movement, into people, so that they could talk about it.
Good evening and welcome. My name is David Susskind. Tonight, our subject is homosexuality. Is it a sickness or a preferred lifestyle?
Oh, David.
Because it's one of those human illnesses that I don't choose
David?
to educate my children too deeply about.
David, why do you have such a vested interest in trying to channel people, narrow down, to program them for this one thing, this one way of life? To conform. Mm-hmm.
I told you why several times, and the audience hoops and howls, and you refute it and deny it, and that has to do with the body of medical evidence suggests that it is a mental aberration.
Is it possible that the body of medical evidence could not have made a mistake?
It is possible,
I have
yes.
a quote.
I don't believe
It's not only possible, I'm almost sure of it.
And see, that was always where I was coming from. I'm not going to allow you to dictate to me about who I am. I know who I am.
Yes, maybe it makes you feel good to be able to say that we're sick. Does it make you feel good?
It's important.
Of course not, Reverend Kennedy.
And I say that the body of knowledge which claims sickness for homosexuality has to be challenged.
At that point in time, we started pressing for meetings and public forums where we could challenge the sickness label. Some well-regarded psychiatrists started to go to bat for us. So the APA finally agreed. They gave us a really good platform at their annual meeting in Dallas. There would be 2 psychiatrists, and they invited Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings. Well, when I heard about the plans for this, I said, well, you know, what you need is one person who is both a psychiatrist and gay.
I got a call from Barbara Giddings. She said, John, I'm looking for a psychiatrist to testify what it is like to be a gay psychiatrist. My first reaction was, no way.
He said, I will lose my job, my medical license. There's still a lot of homophobia in the American Psychiatric Association. John came to Philadelphia in 1964 to start a residency at the University of Pennsylvania. He ran into terrible homophobia there, and he got fired for being gay. He wanted to help with the 1972 meeting in Dallas, but had to protect himself.
He said, I'll do it only on condition that I can wear a wig and a mask and use a voice-distorting microphone.
And Dr. John Fryer became Dr. H, Homosexual Anonymous. And I could hardly believe it. I could have fallen off my chair. We thought he would have on a nice little mask like the Lone Ranger. No, he was in this grotesque big mask, a big wig on. It looked more like Halloween than anything else. We were all very concerned about how this would go over.
I thought this tape was lost to history.
I'm a homosexual. I am a psychiatrist. It is time that real flesh and blood stand up before this organization and ask to be listened to and understood. I am in disguise tonight in order that I might speak freely. What is it like to be a homosexual who is also a psychiatrist? Many of us work 20 hours daily to protect institutions who would literally chew us up and spit us out if they knew the truth. We are taking an even bigger risk, however, in not living fully our humanity, with all the lessons it has to teach all the other humans around us. This is the greatest loss, our honest humanity.
He represented all the people who were hiding and invisible, and it turned out to be just enormously powerful.
It was a game changer that really got some of the psychiatrists rethinking their position.
Gay is good. Gay is proud. We are seeing, close to my heart, the psychiatrists on the run. Keep them running.
Are homosexuals mentally sick, or have they merely chosen an alternative lifestyle? The psychiatric profession will soon decide. A proposal to change the nomenclature has started its way through the American Psychiatric Association.
This was one of the most considered issues in APA history. It was considered by councils, committees, other councils, district branch, assembly, back to district branches, back to assembly. And we needed an effort where we had to be tolerant of both politics and science. And the APA was trying to do that. The Board of Trustees was trying to do that.
This was a revolutionary moment in which homosexuality per se was not a mental disorder. Millions were cured with a stroke of a pen.
We were overwhelmed with joy. We couldn't believe it. I thought we'd be fighting forever. But then suddenly, boom.
Psychoanalysts, especially Socrates and Bieber, thought that this was an assault on psychoanalysis, and they started a referendum by petition to overturn it.
And they raised enough signatures so that the APA had to poll the members.
Socrates' idea was that most psychiatrists still believed that gay people were sick. And of course, the irony of his own son being gay didn't deter Socrates at all.
Years later, I finally had to corner him into seeing him in his office. I said, Dad, you know, this is something that we've both known for a long time, but I need to actually tell you that I'm gay, that I'm attracted to men. And he had a momentary violent reaction where he pulled out a gun and put it to his head. He didn't pull the trigger, I'm sure it wasn't loaded, but said, you know, you can't do this to me. What I needed to do, I accomplished by telling him. And that was it.
The vote really concerned us because no one was sure whether most psychiatrists were in favor of dropping homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
The American Psychiatric Association announced today that its membership has voted to remove homosexuality from the association's list of mental disorders.
In a male referendum, 58% of the membership upheld the earlier decision by the APA's board.
Homosexual organizations see the referendum vote as a landmark decision. In the words of one such organization, the greatest gay victory.
This albatross that had been around our neck was finally lifted. It was as though the world had dropped off our shoulders.
The word spread very quickly, and the effect was electric.
And of course, when we got the result, we hooted and hollered and jumped up and down.
I heard it on the radio. Well, I went out and bought a bottle of champagne. I thought it was time to celebrate. Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our panel. Bennett Singer, Patrick Sammon, Andrew Solomon. I do want to say that I can certainly understand why this film won the Erickson Award, which is given for exemplary work that contributes to a deeper understanding of and greater public awareness about mental health issues. This film is a gift to society, and there are so many lessons to be learned from it that are pertinent to today's political climate. But that's enough from me. Welcome to our panel. Andrew, you can turn your camera on now and join us. And we are interested in hearing your discussion. So thank you all again for sharing your time with the Open Mind audience.
Well, I wanted to say, first of all, what a pleasure it is to be back doing an event for the CEMO, and what an honor it is to be doing an event with these remarkable and distinguished filmmakers. I won't go through a long introduction since Vicky has kindly already provided one, but I think almost anyone watching this film will have been blown away by how powerful it is, and also I think by the extraordinary distance that we've traveled. Everyone is very aware, or at least many people in the field are very aware of the Stonewall riots and their immediate aftermath. People are aware of Obergefell and the legalization of gay marriage, but what came in between that allowed this movement to move faster than almost any other civil rights movement in history has often been obscure or lost. And so I thought I would begin by asking the filmmakers how they see this moment, which they have so beautifully documented, as fitting into the larger questions of the fight for LGBTQ as it now is, or gay as it then was, liberation.
Well, I appreciate that kind introduction, and thank you to the Institute for hosting this. It's wonderful to be with you and all of the folks who are tuning in tonight. You know, I think the answer to your question really is at the root of why we decided to make this film. A friend of mine put it on my radar back in 2014. I was a bit aware of this story, but it struck me as something that would make an incredible documentary. And I recruited my friend and now colleague, Bennett Singer, to join me on this journey. And one of the first revelations that we uncovered was just how central this moment was. When you look at the path that you mapped out between Stonewall and Obergefell, really this had to be the first domino to fall. As long as we were classified as mentally ill, then business and government were going to use that as an excuse to discriminate. And that was very apparent to us early on as we started doing the research, and it made us so energized to figure out a way to tell this story. And it's been such a humbling experience to put the activists at the heart of the story, the people who achieved this victory. And I hope we've done justice to those who brought about this important achievement.
Well, I think you've done amazing justice to them. And even though I was alive in 1973, and indeed for a number of years prior to that, I nonetheless am shocked seeing this by the extent of the punishments that were visited on people. The old trifecta is that homosexuality was considered an illness, a crime, and a sin, despite the surprising support that the Mormon Church has now offered to the legalization of gay marriage. I think there's still a strong sense that the issue of sin plays large in our society. The battle to get rid of the vision of homosexuality as a crime is one that was fought actually after this one about whether it was a sickness. Do you have a sense of why the things happened in that order and what the reasons were? Why was it the turning point? Why was it the first step before those other matters could be addressed?
Well, I think Frank Kameny, who was himself sort of an accidental activist and who had training as a scientist and had received his PhD at Harvard and was working for the government until he was summarily fired when they accused him of being a homosexual and therefore being unfit for government service. I think Frank Kameny had this very central belief that this needed to be the first domino to fall because the illness label was so overreaching, and that if you took that away, then other institutions would no longer be able to use that cloak of pathology to justify discrimination. You know, ultimately the military, faith communities, boards of education, other aspects of civil rights fell into place after the sickness label was removed. And I do think Kameny was pretty brilliant in having that sense of a sequence. And I also think, you know, this notion of dignity, which I went back and looked at Justice Kennedy's opinion on same-sex marriage and Obergefell and his really moving argument that at the heart of the justification for legalizing same-sex marriage was this equal right to legal dignity. And I think for LGBTQ Americans, this paradigm shift that came about with the removal of homosexuality as a diagnosis in the DSM was a huge step towards our own sense of dignity or self-acceptance, and that really also played into this momentum that mobilized and catalyzed activists and citizens who didn't think of themselves as activists to pursue further change and progress and equal rights and first-class citizenship. So in some sense, it wasn't only about persuading psychiatrists, but helping LGBTQ folks reshape their image of themselves. And again, I think Kameny understood that, and maybe that was also part of his rationale for making this the first domino.
It's interesting to me to watch it and to think about my own adventures, which I've written about in seeking out for myself a kind of fairly gentle, but still a kind of conversion therapy many, many years ago when I was a teenager. And I would like to think that that doesn't happen anymore, but I think that it still does. Do you see the backlash as personified, I suppose, in Ron DeSantis and the other people, Clarence Thomas and other people who've spoken out so vigorously against gay rights, the parents on a variety of school boards and so on and so forth? Do you see all of that as being a matter of trying to reverse this? Do you think it's irreversible so far as the American Psychiatric Association goes, but how irreversible do you think it is in the culture at large?
Well, I'll go first. Bennett, I'm sure you might have different opinions or complementary opinions. I am very much an optimist about where we're at and where we're going. I'm, open-eyed about the people who are still standing up against us. We face a threat in many state capitals, and particularly the targeting the trans community. And we need to be vigorous in sort of standing up to advocate for equality for everyone. And so that's a very clear fight that we still have to win. But I don't think we should lose sight of the progress that's been made in terms of the journey you mapped out, Andrew, to start from Stonewall to Obergefell in less than 50 years is just an astonishing accomplishment. And I'm not saying that marriage is the be all and end all in terms of what we were fighting for, because there's more work to do. But since then, of course, you've had the Supreme Court affirm the notion that LGBT people can't be fired. And that was a significant Supreme Court decision that came after marriage. So I understand there's more work to do. And a lot of that work, it happens in the halls of power, obviously, in fighting back harmful legislation and trying to overturn that harmful legislation that's passed. But the lion's share of the work still that remains is in churches and synagogues and places of worship. It's around dinner tables. It's continuing to engage family and friends. And I know when thinking about the work that still needs to be done in terms particularly trans equality, I think there's a real lesson in CURED about the role of allies, because there weren't enough gay and lesbian people within the APA fighting for this issue to have achieved this victory. It took allies from within the APA. And I think there's a real lesson in the film about that. And I think we can all reflect today about the work that allies can play in particularly confronting the hostility that the trans community is facing in some parts of the country, familiarizing ourselves with the issue. And aside from lobbying lawmakers, it's engaging our families and friends who are not aware of these issues. And I think that we can reflect on that. And I hope that's a lesson people take from the film, that the work that allies can play in continuing the work that needs to be done.
That actually leads to the question I was going to ask next. And again, not to keep going into my own autobiography, but my psychoanalyst of many years, whom I wrote about in an obituary for the New Yorker when he died at the beginning of COVID, was a straight man who had been very much involved in the movement in 1973, Richard C. Friedman, who had written a book called Male Homosexuality that was about the idea that homosexuality was not an illness. But the people you interviewed in most instances were actually the gay activists. The allies were all to be seen kind of in the edges of the film. How did you choose the people you would talk to, and what was the process? Who was it you spoke to who didn't make it into the film? And talk a little more about how you came up with its very compelling and very urgent and very electrifying structure.
Well, I can say we did do a lot of pre-interviews and talked to quite a number of folks, but with a 80-minute feature film, which became a 56-minute PBS hour-long riveting version, tight and compelling, you have to make hard choices. And so one of the basic sort of decisions was we wanted to make this a first-person account, and the only people in the film are the central players or participants who were there. We had an amazing board of advisors, psychiatrists and historians, and actually interviewed quite a number of them for the film and had a cut that included their voices. And then primarily at the urging of our impassioned editor, Steve Hefner, we took them all out, and Steve's point was, you don't need outside experts who are brilliant, but no matter how brilliant, it's a different sense of immediacy because they weren't part of the story. And it was a hard choice, but I think for this kind of storytelling, the experts who were there as witnesses really are the most compelling, and that we were able to cover some of the points that we might have had historians or experts in the history of medicine talk about through participants in the story, such as what was Freud's view of homosexuality, or at least a piece of it, or how did Kinsey fit into this question, or some backstory and sort of some of the bigger social and cultural pieces. So also, the tagline of the activists themselves was, "We are the experts on our lives." And that was central to their activism. And so I think it was really a way of honoring them to foreground the story in their first person testimony. When we started doing the research, we were, I think, surprised pleasantly to discover how many central witnesses were still alive, and we kicked into action pretty quickly, even before we had funding to interview people, starting with Ronald Gold, who was in his 80s when we met up with him, and really sat us down and said, he knew he was failing and fading, and he was very vibrant in the interview, but died soon, really quite soon thereafter. And 5 of our other interviewees have since died. And so there was this sense of urgency in terms of capturing their testimony and really grounding it in their eyewitness accounts. Also, I would say we wanted to make it clear, what the sort of opposition they faced was. And Charles Socarides was, I think, the primary personification of that. He had died, before we started production, but we did find quite a bit of archival material to chronicle, hopefully in a neutral and fair way. And there's that question of, was it punishment? I think that was the word you used, or was it his sense of healing and curing and helping, from a well-meaning perspective of a doctor? And that is an open question, I guess, what was truly his motive. But I do think having Dr. Socarides' son, Richard, in the film takes it to another level and really humanizes both Dr. Socarides and his son Richard, and that whole father-son dynamic. And as an aside, there's so much in the film about parents and children. There's that father-son dynamic between Charles and Richard, but also Reverend Kennedy and her mother, and Charles Silverstein and his mother. So there's a lot of perhaps Freudian, or at least parent-child wrangling and dynamics in the film. And I think that's a central piece of what comes through.
And just one more layer of that, Andrew, before I think one of the hard things was, you can see all of these characters, all of these folks who were involved in this. And that's part of what's inspiring about this fight, is it wasn't one person carrying a flag, and it was the people outside the APA and those working from within the APA. And at the end of the day, to Bennett's point, we have to decide how much to include. I mean, in the longer version of the film, we include a reference to the work that Robert Spitzer did. We have a sound bite from Judd Marmer. I know both of them were instrumental in getting this done. We featured Richard Green, who was the first straight psychiatrist to step up and really fight for this change. So it was really, if we were writing a book, we could have included every twist and turn, but it's really hard to decide with a film, as you know, about what to leave out. And I hope we succeeded in conveying it without leaving out anyone unfairly.
Well, I think you did succeed in that, though I hope that you or someone else will write the book, because I think even in the full film, but certainly in this 25-minute version, you have a sense of how much there is to say about this and how complex the story is. I think you put that across well. I'm interested in how you feel who you think the audience for the film is, and how you define that audience for yourself. It seems to me that the way this will read for people who were activists and lived through it, those of them who are still among us, will be different from the way that it's read by people of my a last middle-aged generation, and that the whole narrative will seem exotic and almost implausible to many people who are in the generation that's growing up now. And I wondered whether you have a sense that you're trying to reach all of those people, and if so, what you think their responses would be to what you've done.
Well, I can say, at least in theory, we do indeed want to try to reach all of those people, and Patrick can perhaps speak to the youth audience, because he spent this morning showing CURED to a group of high school students who are in a social justice class in Maryland, if I'm getting that right. And we are partnering with an amazing organization called History Unerased, whose mission is to create curriculum materials for schools. And we're working with them to create a version of the film, but a really robust curriculum for history and social studies classes, not only for the LGBT alliances or for students who have already, come out in school, but as this to us, our goal is, in the school context, this is a piece of American history, of the history of science, of human rights, and it has so many potential applications within a classroom. So there is that piece. And I don't know, Patrick, if you want to jump in terms of what the students kind of took away, but it's heartening, I think, that there is this hunger and interest in history among 16-year-olds.
Yeah, and I hope that's one of the things we're able to do with it is connect with more young people in particular, so they can reflect on where we were. I think, today's presentation, I think there were 60 high school students in the class, and we watched the same clip that we saw today. And there's some astonishment that this is the way it was in the not too distant past. And I think that Bennett and I, in terms of casting a wide net with our target audience, that was really why we were committed to having this film on PBS. And so we were thrilled that there was a national broadcast on Independent Lens last October, actually National Coming Out Day of 2021, which was such an appropriate day to be able to feature this story. And there were 1.5 million viewers. And what Netflix and HBO, those are great, but you need a subscription, and you really have to find a program like this. And we thought casting a wide net where it's free and people tuning in maybe in Kentucky or Alabama might land on it who might not agree with the viewpoint in the film, or might have been sympathetic to this viewpoint. So we really wanted to make it widely available, and the film couldn't have been made without the support we received from the independent television service via support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But I think, between the television broadcast and then film festivals, we're doing screenings at medical schools. So that's another piece of the equation. Bennett, what was the amount of education that the typical medical student gets in
Right,
LGBT?
yes. According to a recent survey, the average time that a medical student spends focusing on LGBTQ issues throughout their medical school educational career is 5 hours, which came as a bit of a jolt. And so there has been this really very positive reception from medical schools and some grant money to help make this national tour happen, which is now underway. Again, not only for the LGBTQ folks, but I think every doctor, and not only for psychiatrists. As someone, I guess we could all talk about our experiences as patients, but to me, there's such a long way to go in terms of the disparities that LGBTQ folks face within the medical system in general, and that, at least for me, that ever-present question or doubt in my head, like if I'm going to a cardiologist or a dermatologist, how much do I reveal or not reveal about my own personal life, which is so connected to my role as a patient? And yet it isn't an even playing field. And I think, no matter how out and proud and comfortable I am, there are moments when I'm like, oh, I'm not going to mention my husband or my work or this film. It's an ever, I don't know. I think there's a long way to go to make LGBTQ folks feel comfortable in medical settings. And of course, those concerns are amplified exponentially for trans patients and people in other aspects of the community.
Yes, people always talk about having come out, on March 17th, 2003. And I feel like, no, actually, you have to go through this day after day after day. I was at a meeting, actually, I'm on the board of a medical school, and we had a meeting, and I was seated next to an older doctor, and we were making pleasant conversation before the meeting began. And he said to me, no, I think I met your wife the last time that that we were at one of these meetings. And I said, no, actually, you didn't. And he said, I was sure I had. He said, didn't I meet your wife? And I said, I don't have a wife. I have a husband. You might have met him, but it felt as though I was being confrontational with this pleasant elderly man, and as though I was reprimanding him in some way. And I thought, what is the gentle or direct way to do this? You've alluded a few times to the trans movement, and I almost feel as though in 20 or 30 or 50, or maybe if we're lucky, just 5 years, there will be space to make a film that really parallels this one, that's about what's happening to trans people now, and about the attempt to determine whether trans people, or to establish that trans people have full and equal rights, and that they aren't suffering just from a dysphoria that should be resolved by returning them to happiness in their original bodies. The issue has become very loaded. I gave a lecture in Texas last month at which they specifically asked me not to mention trans issues, which meant that I did mention them. But tell me what your feeling is about how this parallels the moment we're in for trans people.
Well, I can jump in and say, certainly, there's the direct DSM issue related to that question. And I think the shift in the DSM certainly has gone a long way to depathologize trans identities, because previously, the DSM said that gender identity disorder was a diagnosis, and that really does pathologize an identity. Now, what the DSM looks at is, or refers to, is gender dysphoria, which is this disconnect between a person's gender identity and the gender they were assigned at birth. And having that, of course, there is a debate about what are the pros and cons of having any diagnosis relating to one's identity, but having that in the DSM does allow reimbursement for procedures and treatments that trans folks actively want. So we've been on some panels with various advocates and psychiatrists and people who are working now to consider updates to the DSM, and that question is an open one. But I think at least understanding the reasons that the diagnosis was changed and the benefits that come from having gender dysphoria in the DSM is a starting point. But I also think, there really is this, is it unprecedented or a very active attack on trans folks happening right now, and more legislation, as I understand it, anti-trans legislation has been introduced this year than in any previous year. And it seems to me that one really clear parallel between CURED and what's happening now is this battle between science and prejudice, and data and evidence on the one hand, and bigotry and sort of prejudiced views or assumptions on the other. And that when it comes to legislation, or attempts to restrict trans young people from receiving healthcare, or also related to the Don't Say Gay bill, there's this battle between science on the one hand and prejudice on the other, and efforts to politicize that debate, I think, can be incredibly harmful for the people who are whose lives are at stake. And so it's not an academic. I guess that was another goal that we wanted to drive home with CURED. It's not simply about some words in a medical manual sitting on a shelf. The stakes really do matter, whether it's telling gay people that they can and should be cured, or cutting off healthcare support for trans youth. those parallels, I think, do have such profound consequences for people's lives. And so activism, I think, is a key response. You know, as the poster for CURED says, the remedy was rebellion. And I think that you know, remains very true.
I think part of what you capture, in fact, is that the rebellion was also exciting. I don't know whether I would quite want to use the word. I mean, what was happening was so awful that to describe the rebellion as fun seems to trivialize the anguish of the people who were, you know, who are in the film, talking about that man in Oklahoma and waiting for his ECT treatments and so on and so forth, which I wouldn't want to do. But you do capture the kind of vivid and glowing and visceral satisfaction of facing a Goliath and managing in one way or another to succeed in the face of that. Did you, as you were working on the film, on the one hand, documenting things that must have been traumatic for you to encounter, also find it inspiring to look at the way that this triumph had been achieved?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we, you know, throughout the editing process and really from the beginning, we knew we wanted to talk about the stakes in terms of those horrible treatments that some people suffered, the ECT and lobotomy, and even, you know, the people like Charles Silverstein, who went to a therapist for a psychoanalysis 3 times a year for 7 years trying to get cured. So we wanted to be very clear in showing people the effect that this had on people at the time. And we thought, you know, it is, particularly in this presentation today, showing the film to young people, you know, it is, some of them are traumatized, or not overstating it, but there's concerns like, how much do we show young people of these treatments, if you will? But I think we would be doing an injustice, a disservice to the people who lived through that kind of brutal treatment by not showing it. I think we need to do it in a respectful way, and we weren't trying to, you know, scare people or make it too shocking, but we also wanted to be very clear in showing what these treatments were like. To your point, though, it was so inspiring to meet the people who were part of this fight. I remember Gary Allender, who was not part of the clip we just showed. He was one of the people who participated in the first ZAP, as it was called, at the APA meeting in San Francisco in 1970. And he talks about how empowering it was and how great it was to be able to confront their opponent. The way he described it, you know, you can't confront the president or the Pope, but we could confront these psychiatrists who were standing up against us and treating us so poorly. And he talked about how liberating that was, and how empowered he felt to fight for his rights, and also just to feel confident and good about who he was. So I think that was a common theme throughout the people who were saying, as Reverend Kennedy, enough is enough, we're not going to take it anymore. And that was so inspiring to be able to meet those folks and get their firsthand testimony about what these events were like.
I think before we go to questions, I would just say that I do some teaching in the LGBTQ department of the university where I studied. And when I began, the person who set up the department was Larry Kramer, who is not involved in this particular issue, but who certainly was very much involved in the battles. And he described being gay on that campus in the 1950s, and unsurprisingly made a suicide attempt. And I listened to him talking about it, and I thought, well, thank goodness I was there in the mid 80s and not in the early 50s, because my experiences were so much better than his. But when I go back now and see the kids who are there now, I feel, you know, deeply jealous of some of the things that they have, and imagine what it would be like to be growing up now and with the attitudes they have rather than then and with the ones I had. And my hope is always that when they reach my age, that they will go back to the campus and be similarly jealous of a next generation. And I think your film really points a way for that to happen. And I hope that it not only shocks the people who didn't know these things did happen, but also galvanizes people to stand against the things that are happening, which, as you've both pointed out, there are many of in this very time. Vicki, I think you had some questions from the audience you wanted to share.
Yes. First of all, thank you all for this very informative and first of all, the film is so impactful and your discussion just illuminated so many issues in it. So thank you all for doing this program for us. We do have some questions from the audience. First question is, I think for either Bennett or Patrick, how did the APA react to the news that you wanted to make a film about this particular piece of history?
Well, to their credit, I mean, I know we're familiar with organizations that want to hide history that's embarrassing. And to the APA's credit, they've done the opposite, really. We would have made the film even without their, interest in having it made, but we were able to get access to their archives, and a lot of the great images we found and some of the newspaper headlines are from the APA's collection. And, as some of you may know, the APA today is led by an openly gay psychiatrist, Dr. Saul Levin, as the CEO and medical director. And that, more than anything, is evidence of how far that organization has come, where they were standing up in opposition to LGBT people 50 years ago, and now they are alongside with us as this work goes on, particularly confronting conversion therapy, which is still happening around the country, legal in 30 states for parents to send their minor children there. So the APA has been a great partner, and they were also very generous, the APA Foundation, in supporting our outreach and engagement campaign, which we've been able to do more than 125 mostly virtual screenings all around the world with LGBT organizations and mental health groups. So it's been a great collaboration with them, and shining a spotlight on this embarrassing part of their past, but also one we can all learn from as the work continues.
Thank you. And that's very heartening to hear that they were so supportive. You mentioned that conversion therapy. Where do things stand in the movement to ban conversion therapy today?
Well, there is an active campaign underway, and we've partnered with two of the leading organizations that are working quite diligently on a state-by-state level. That would be Born Perfect and the Trevor Project. As I understand it, 14 countries around the world have enacted national bans on conversion therapy. And it's kind of an eclectic grouping of countries, including Brazil and Taiwan. And just this year, France and Canada. There's a pledge in the UK to end conversion therapy, but that hasn't yet been enacted. So my thought and question would be, if they can do it in Malta, nothing against Malta, but could there possibly be more of a will here to enact a national ban, which there is legislation in Congress to that effect, and yet it doesn't seem to have much traction. So at the moment, it's a state-by-state campaign. 20 states have outlawed the practice of minors being treated by licensed medical professionals for, so-called conversion therapy. And every major medical organization, including the APA and the AMA, is on record as saying this is a harmful and discredited practice, which is, of course, very heartening. But it remains, a threat to young people and older people too. And I think that the gist of what, the goal of conversion therapy is exactly what we showed in CURED. The claim that someone needs to be fixed or converted or cured based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so we have found that where in certain cases where state legislators are considering bans, we've been able to set up screenings. And my hope is that this history can really help mobilize not only citizens, but also legislators to think about the reasons to ban this practice. And that's been one really hopeful, I think, aspect of our outreach campaign to really try to shine a spotlight on this history as a way of mobilizing people on this issue.
Thank you. You are the activists of today.
Well, I guess there is an element of activism to what we're trying to do with this history, and I hope that people can reflect, even beyond the LGBTQ movement, in the ways that this story can be sort of a blueprint for social change and a source of hope. There's that Margaret Mead quote that the Institute featured in the slideshow, and I do think there's something really profound about that notion of a small group of committed people can change the world. And at its core, CURED is an example of that, I think, and a source of hope, because I think when the activists began their campaign, it was considered so unlikely that this profoundly venerable institution would respond to some ragtag band of protesters, and that the paradigm shift happened so quickly from the first ZAP in 1970 to the board vote in 1973 is a miraculous kind of case study in social change and activism.
Thank you. Andrew, you talked about going back to your alma mater, which I believe is Yale. And what do you see now that gives you hope, and with the student body today, with the students that are on campus today?
Well, in the first place, I see that most of the students who are gay are, or at least many of the students who are LGBTQ are out. They feel comfortable being out. They don't feel frightened by what the response of the community and their family will be. I think there's just an openness and a kind of acceptingness, which is simply assumed as the condition of that college, but indeed of many colleges, most liberal colleges, of many high schools, that people don't go through all of those years of self-torture. I think people see, I don't know, Pete Buttigieg or whoever else it may be, and they don't have the sense that I once had, that, if you were going to be openly gay, there were a lot of jobs you couldn't have, there were a lot of clubs you couldn't belong to, there were a lot of, and I don't mean clubs in the formal sense that there were those too, but sort of associations, that there were people who would not like you because you were gay. That I think the sense of isolation and fear are different. They're different on the Yale campus. I interviewed someone recently in connection with a project I'm doing who works on the hotline at the Trevor Project, which is devoted to counseling LGBTQ youth who are considering suicide. Somebody called in whom he had spoken to shortly before we met, and he was still very shaken by it, who said, "I'm 14 and I just came out to my parents." He said, "And my father said, 'Your mother and I are going to leave the house now. My gun is on the kitchen table. You know what you should do.'" So it's wonderful that liberal East Coast universities have opened up in the ways that they have. And it's wonderful that there are so many different possibilities out there, but there are also many people for whom that liberalization remains quite remote, and who have trouble seeing it. So cured, yes, but with conversion therapies and so on, I think the process of establishing that people don't need to be cured is, cured, or in this instance, effectively murdered, it's an ongoing battle. And I think part of what's powerful about the film is that it advances that cause and that idea.
Thank you, Andrew. We're nearly out of time, but we have a couple of more comments and questions that I'd like to get to. First, from Sandra, having grown up in Canada and only known homosexuality as legal, which was legalized in 1969 when she was 5, she didn't know how much of this history, so she thanks you for telling this story, as we all do. and mentions wanting to see the whole film. And I do want to add that the filmmakers have graciously offered to make the whole film available for all our open mind audience for, I believe, 4 or 5 days. And in the thank you note, which you will receive tomorrow, you will receive that link. So thank you to the filmmakers for your generosity in providing that. Not a question, but as an LGBTQ person, I just wanted to say thank you for making this film. It was very informative to see and learn. I had no idea what homosexuals went through back then. And I think that goes for a lot of us, that we didn't really know all that some of those scenes were just horrifying. Very grateful to you for telling this story. And then time for our last question from Penny. How did you come up with the title CURED?
Well, it actually was the first, that was the first part of the moment the idea came on our radar. That was the title from the very first day. And there was just something that seemed to sum up what this fight was all about. That, as I think Richard Green says, or maybe in this clip or in the longer one, with the stroke of a pen, millions were cured. So we just thought the play, it sort of was a great way to summarize what this fight was about. And it has sort of multiple meanings. So we thought it was a perfect title.
It certainly is. So thank you, Bennett, Patrick, Andrew. Thank you so much for participating in this discussion. Bennett and Patrick, thank you for making the film again and making it available for our open mind audience. I want to thank everybody that tuned in today. Thank you for the privilege of your time. From all of us at the Friends of the Seminole Institute and the Resnick Board, we want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and look forward to seeing you back for our next Open Mind program, which will be on December 6th, when our featured guest will be Florence Williams, author of Heartbreak, A Personal and Scientific Journey. And she will be in conversation with UCLA Professor of Psychiatry, Dr. Steve Cole. So wish you all a safe evening and be well. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
You.